The morning of March 18, 1943, dawned much like any other day dedicated to rigorous training at the Naval Air Station Jacksonville. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley observed his cadre of dive bomber trainees as they prepared to board their SPD Dauntless aircraft, the very same formidable machines that had decisively altered the course of the Battle of Midway a mere 9 months prior. However, a disconcerting anomaly was apparent in the casualty figures. Over the preceding 6-week interval, Flatley had tragically lost a greater number of aviators to mishaps occurring during training exercises than he had throughout the entirety of the Guadalcanal campaign, a period marked by intense, actual combat. The emerging pattern was both unmistakable and profoundly alarming, casting a pall over the entire operation. These incidents were not attributable to the typical errors of inexperienced novices, nor were they a consequence of mechanical malfunctions. Instead, seasoned pilots, individuals who had already demonstrated their prowess and fortitude by surviving multiple combat engagements, were executing impeccably precise, textbook-perfect dive-bombing maneuvers directly into the unforgiving ocean. Dispatches arriving from other naval air training facilities across the nation corroborated this unsettling phenomenon. At NAS Corpus Christi, at NAS Pensacola, and at various airfields nationwide, dive bomber pilots were perishing under circumstances that defied all conventional tactical rationale. They would meticulously roll their aircraft inverted, commence their descent into the dive, meticulously maintain the precise 70-degree angle mandated by operational doctrine, and flawlessly track their designated targets through the bomb site, only to inexplicably fail to initiate recovery. There were no frantic radio transmissions signaling distress, nor any erratic flight path deviations indicative of control surface issues. We invite you to stay with us and watch the end of this video. We would be immensely grateful for your like and subscription. Please also consider leaving a comment below, sharing where you are from, and what your thoughts are on the compelling topic we are discussing. The aircraft would stubbornly maintain its precipitous dive angle, continuing its descent well past the designated bomb release point and beyond the critical safe pull-out altitude, until the immutable laws of physics rendered any attempt at recovery utterly impossible. Subsequent crash investigations consistently revealed that the control surfaces remained fully intact, the engines continued to operate flawlessly, and the airframe showed no structural damage apart from the catastrophic impact itself. It was as if the pilots had inexplicably succumbed to sleep at the most perilous juncture. Yet, they had not merely fallen asleep. The events unfolding within those cockpits were demonstrably more insidious and complex than simple fatigue. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics had been receiving a growing number of disquieting field reports since the latter part of 1942, but the true magnitude of the crisis only became undeniably apparent when squadron after squadron began to lose pilots to what official communiques euphemistically termed failure to recover from the dive. This carefully chosen phrase served to obscure a harsher, more uncomfortable truth that no one was eager to confront. The very dive bombing technique that had secured victory at the pivotal Battle of Midway was now, ironically, claiming the lives of the skilled aviators who had so masterfully perfected it. The inherent precision and unwavering discipline that rendered dive bombing so devastatingly effective against the Imperial Japanese Navy's carriers had inadvertently created a physiological predicament that the human body was simply not equipped to endure. The USS Yorktown's Air Group 3 was renowned for its exceptional precision, a distinction earned not by inexperienced recruits fresh from their initial flight training, but by seasoned combat veterans. These aviators had honed their formidable skills through intense engagements in the Solomons campaign, demonstrating an uncanny ability to accurately deliver a 1,000-pound ordnance package onto a destroyer's deck from an altitude of 10,000 feet. However, a stark tragedy unfolded on March 22, 1943, during what was anticipated to be a routine training exercise off the sun-drenched Florida coast. Lieutenant Robert Chin, piloting his Dauntless dive bomber, inexplicably failed to execute his pull-out maneuver. His wingman, Ensign Marcus Webb, observed with growing horror as Chin's aircraft maintained its steep dive angle, hurtling past the designated bomb release point and beyond the critical altitude where recovery should have commenced. The Dauntless ultimately plunged into the ocean in a near-vertical impact, leaving virtually no salvageable wreckage. This devastating loss marked the squadron's third fatality within a mere fortnight, and tragically, the series of misfortunes was far from over. Just 5 days subsequent to Lieutenant Chin's demise, Lieutenant William Stamper commenced his dive during an identical training exercise. His radio transmissions remained ominously silent, and his aircraft steadfastly adhered to its destructive trajectory. Onlookers stationed on the Yorktown's flight deck tracked Stamper's SBD through their binoculars, witnessing it hold its dive through every marked altitude, all the while anticipating a pullout that never materialized. The eventual impact generated a dramatic plume of white water, clearly discernible for many miles across the sea. The irony of Stamper's fate was particularly poignant. He had served as Chin's flight instructor and was a veteran who had endured the brutal carrier battles of Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, boasting an impressive record of over 300 carrier landings. Yet, he perished during a training maneuver he could undoubtedly have executed flawlessly in his sleep. Upon the squadron's return to the Yorktown that very afternoon, the commanding officer immediately grounded the entire dive bomber contingent, initiating a comprehensive investigation into the unsettling pattern of accidents. We kindly invite you to remain with us and witness the conclusion of this compelling video. Your appreciation through a like and a subscription would be greatly valued. Furthermore, please feel free to share your origins in the comments section and offer your reflections on the subject matter discussed in the video. Admiral Mark Mitcher, the formidable commander overseeing Fast Carrier Task Force operations, recognized the dire gravity of the situation. He promptly issued a decisive directive to the Bureau of Aeronautics, demanding an immediate cessation of treating these recurring incidents as isolated occurrences. Instead, he insisted they be confronted as a profound systemic crisis demanding urgent attention. The extensive investigation that ensued meticulously compiled and analyzed data from every single Navy and Marine Corps dive bomber squadron actively engaged in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters of operation. The ensuing statistics were nothing short of staggering. Between November 1942 and April 1943, the United States Navy had suffered the loss of 47 dive bomber pilots due solely to pull-out failures during training exercises. This figure shockingly surpassed the total number of pilots lost to enemy action during the identical time frame. Furthermore, reports from active combat squadrons indicated that a significant 15 to 20% of pilots experienced at least a partial blackout during operational dives. Several critical combat missions had even been severely compromised when section leaders lost consciousness mid-attack, forcing their wingmen to abandon their offensive maneuvers and escort the incapacitated aircraft back to safety. In response to this alarming data, the Bureau convened an emergency panel at the Anacostia Naval Air Station. This critical assembly brought together a diverse group of experts, including distinguished flight surgeons, innovative aircraft designers, seasoned combat squadron leaders, and crucially, pilots who had survived blackout incidents themselves. For 3 intense days in early April, this panel meticulously deconstructed every preconceived notion and established principle concerning dive bombing technique. Test pilots bravely flew instrumented dives, equipped with sophisticated medical monitoring apparatus strapped to their chests, meticulously recording precise data on heart rate, blood pressure, and blood oxygen levels during each distinct phase of the dive and subsequent pullout. High-speed cameras, strategically mounted in accompanying chase aircraft, captured the exact moments when pilots' heads would slump forward or their hands would involuntarily release the control stick. The accumulated evidence was unequivocally irrefutable. The standard dive bombing profile, as rigorously taught in every Navy flight school, was fundamentally physiologically unsustainable. Pilots were being trained to execute a maneuver that human biology simply could not reliably endure. The prevailing doctrine undeniably required a radical overhaul, yet no member of that distinguished panel could initially agree on a viable alternative that wouldn't compromise the pinpoint accuracy that made dive bombing such a potent and indispensable tactical asset. The pivotal breakthrough, however, emerged from an entirely unforeseen quarter. It did not originate from the esteemed admirals or the erudite flight surgeons, but rather from a relatively junior officer, Lieutenant Junior Grade Thomas Riley, a seasoned aviator who had been flying perilous combat missions off the USS Enterprise since the Battle of Midway. Riley had quietly adopted a practice that flagrantly contravened every established principle of dive bombing doctrine, maintaining his silence about it due to an understandable apprehension of reprimand. Instead of initiating his pullout at the prescribed altitude of 2,500 feet and releasing his bomb during the initial phase of the recovery arc, Riley had consistently extended his dives to 2,000 feet, and on occasion, even as low as 1,800 feet. At these significantly lower altitudes, his aircraft remained in a nearly vertical attitude when the bomb was released. Following this deeper release, he would then execute a more gradual and controlled pullout, effectively distributing the intense G-forces over an extended period. From the perspective of the official manual, this technique was entirely counterintuitive. Pilots were instructed to release their bombs early in the pull-out sequence to maximize recovery time. Yet, Riley's bombing scores were inexplicably superior to those of every other pilot in his squadron, and remarkably, he had never once experienced even a partial gray-out. When Riley finally elucidated his unconventional technique during the Anacostia Conference, the initial reaction from the panel was one of profound skepticism, bordering on outright hostility. A senior commander from the Bureau of Aeronautics bluntly accused him of misrepresenting his release altitudes, asserting that consistent accuracy from below 2,000 feet was an impossibility, especially given that the existing bomb sight calculations did not even account for such low-altitude releases. However, Riley possessed compelling evidence in the form of gun camera footage. When the panel meticulously reviewed this film, they were confronted with irrefutable visual data that fundamentally contradicted every established understanding they held regarding bombing accuracy. Riley's bombs consistently impacted within a circular error probable (CP) of just 35 feet, a performance substantially superior to the 65-foot CP that was traditionally regarded as excellent for dive bombing operations. The underlying aerodynamic rationale for this remarkable precision became unequivocally clear once experts meticulously ran the numbers. The standard dive bombing technique involved releasing the ordnance early in the pullout arc, when the aircraft was typically transitioning through a dive angle of approximately 60 degrees. At such an angle, the bomb possessed a significant horizontal velocity component, which necessitated complex calculations and corrections. Wind effects at this altitude were substantial, and the bomb's trajectory described an intricate parabolic curve, demanding that the pilot accurately lead the target and account for a multitude of dynamic variables. In stark contrast, Riley's ultra-low releases occurred when the aircraft remained almost perfectly vertical, plunging at an angle between 75 and 85 degrees nose down. At this extreme angle, the bomb essentially dropped straight down, with a minimal horizontal component. Consequently, wind effects became negligible, and the trajectory was, in essence, a straight line from the point of release to the point of impact. This ballistic simplicity directly translated into enhanced accuracy. The very bombsight mathematics that had been deemed incorrect for low-altitude releases were, in fact, perfectly suited. They had simply never been properly validated or tested because prevailing doctrine dictated that a pilot would be fatally incapacitated before reaching such dangerously low altitudes. The G-force mitigation achieved by Riley's method was equally significant. By extending the duration of his dive, and then executing a more gradual pull-out, Riley was effectively distributing the same total G-load over a period of 7 or 8 seconds, as opposed to compressing it into a mere 4 seconds. This strategic distribution resulted in significantly lower peak G-forces, hovering around 4.5 gs instead of the perilous 6 or 7 gs, thus keeping him safely below the critical blackout threshold. Crucially, the more gradual onset of G-forces afforded his cardiovascular system sufficient time to compensate. His blood pressure could adjust progressively, enabling him to maintain his anti-G straining techniques throughout the entire maneuver, rather than having his physiological defenses overwhelmed by a sudden and intense spike. While this technique undeniably demanded exceptional courage and nerve, requiring the pilot to delve deeper into the danger zone before initiating recovery, the underlying physics were absolutely irrefutable. The evidence overwhelmingly demonstrated that lower, more gradual pullouts were demonstrably both safer and remarkably more accurate than the established doctrine that was tragically claiming the lives of pilots week after week. Even prior to these revelations, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, had been diligently conducting extensive wind tunnel research on bomb trajectories since 1941. However, no one had considered applying their invaluable data to the specific scenarios of ultra-low altitude releases until Riley's groundbreaking technique necessitated a comprehensive reevaluation. When NACA engineers at the Langley Research Center subsequently ran the full aerodynamic models, they uncovered a truth that, in hindsight, should have been glaringly obvious but had been obscured for decades by entrenched doctrinal assumptions. The standard 2,500-foot release point, it was discovered, had never been selected for its inherent accuracy. Its primary rationale had always been safety, providing pilots with the maximum possible time to recover if any unforeseen complication arose. Yet, this crucial safety margin had been calculated under the flawed premise that pilots would remain fully conscious and entirely capable throughout the entire pull-out sequence, an assumption that was now demonstrably false and tragically costing lives. The detailed wind tunnel data conclusively elucidated why lower release altitudes consistently yielded tighter impact patterns. A bomb released at 2,500 feet during the initial phase of a pull-out traveled through approximately 180 feet of horizontal displacement before ultimately striking its target. During that extended flight time, it was susceptible to a multitude of external forces, including wind drift, variations in air density, and the complex aerodynamic interactions between the bomb stabilizing fins and the turbulent air churning behind the diving aircraft. Even minute variations in release timing, differences as slight as a tenth of a second, could translate into a substantial missed distance of 15 or 20 feet on the target. In stark contrast, a bomb released at 1,800 feet, when the aircraft was in a near vertical attitude, traveled perhaps only 40 feet horizontally before impact. The dramatically reduced flight time, coupled with a far simpler trajectory, meant that the margin for error was drastically diminished. Consequently, release timing variations that would induce significant misses at higher altitudes produced only negligible deviations at these much lower, more precise release points. Empirical confirmation of these findings was robustly provided by an exhaustive analysis of combat footage. The Navy had, since the Battle of Midway, maintained a meticulous collection of gun camera film from every single combat mission. This invaluable archive contained frame-by-frame records of thousands of bomb releases, complete with visible impact points. When analysts painstakingly reviewed this extensive film library, specifically correlating release altitudes with corresponding accuracy, the relationship was undeniable and striking. Pilots, who released their ordnance below 2,000 feet, whether intentionally adopting Riley's method or accidentally by extending their dives for too long, consistently achieved impact patterns that were 40% tighter than those achieved by pilots adhering to the doctrinal 2,500-foot release altitude. The very lowest releases, specifically those executed between 1,600 and 900 feet, produced astonishing accuracies, approaching the precision that had previously only been attainable through much slower glide bombing attacks. The careful analysis of G-force distribution provided crucial insights into the performance limitations previously encountered. Utilizing sophisticated accelerometers meticulously installed within specially designated test aircraft, aeronautical engineers were able to construct precise maps detailing the G-loading profiles for recovery maneuvers initiated from various altitudes. It became evident that a pullout commencing at 2,500 feet above the target necessitated an immediate and forceful application of maximum back pressure on the control stick. In such a scenario, the pilot was acutely aware of rapidly diminishing altitude, compelling an abrupt arrest of the dive. This intensely aggressive recovery action invariably generated a severe G-force spike, typically ranging between 6 and 7 gs, which was the direct cause of pilot blackouts and subsequent loss of control. Conversely, a pullout initiated from a significantly lower altitude of 1,800 feet could, paradoxically, be executed with greater gradualness. This was precisely because the aircraft began its recovery closer to the water, albeit in a more vertical trajectory, which allowed for a considerably longer and thus less strenuous recovery arc. This revised approach meant that instead of an abrupt, instinctual yanking of the control stick, the pilot could instead apply a steady, progressive back pressure, gently rolling the aircraft out of its dive over an extended period. The identical change in altitude was thereby accomplished through the application of far gentler forces on both the aircraft and the pilot. Under this new methodology, the peak G-load consistently remained below 5 gs, a threshold comfortably within the physiological limits where pilots could reliably maintain full consciousness, retain peripheral vision, and continue to function with complete mental acuity and operational effectiveness. The task of altering established doctrine was itself a monumental undertaking, but the challenge of retraining an entire combat aviation force to execute maneuvers diametrically opposed to decades of ingrained muscle memory represented an altogether different beast. Consequently, in June of 1943, the United States Navy took decisive action, establishing an experimental dive bombing school at Naval Air Station Jacksonville. This critical initiative was placed under the direct and discerning supervision of Commander Flatley. The entire training curriculum was painstakingly reconstructed from its foundations, centered around what the naval strategists formally termed the delayed pullout technique. Although the pilots themselves, with their characteristic combat vernacular, quickly adopted more colloquial phrases like riding the edge or simply the late pull. We invite you to stay with us and watch the end of this insightful video. We would be incredibly grateful for your like and subscription. Please also consider leaving a comment below, sharing where you are from and your thoughts on this fascinating topic. The initial and perhaps most formidable hurdle was psychological in nature, persuading seasoned aviators that deliberately descending closer to the water before initiating recovery was not an act of suicidal recklessness, but rather a demonstrably safer and more effective operational paradigm. The instructional regimen commenced with classroom sessions that bore a striking resemblance to advanced physics lectures rather than conventional flight briefings. Pilots were subjected to comprehensive presentations on G-induced loss of consciousness, meticulously illustrated with detailed charts depicting cerebral blood flow patterns during extreme high-G maneuvers, alongside precise graphs correlating the rate of G onset with the probability of experiencing a blackout. Specialized flight surgeons provided exhaustive explanations of the precise physiological events that transpired within the human visual system when the delicate retinas were deprived of adequate oxygen. The instructors meticulously ensured that every pilot grasped the fundamental principle. This was not a matter of individual courage or inherent skill. It was unequivocally a matter of fundamental human biology. The most valorous and proficient pilot in the world would inevitably succumb to a blackout at 6 gs if he applied excessive force to the stick too rapidly. The overarching objective was not to heroically combat the inexorable G-forces, but rather to intelligently manage them, to distribute their impact over a longer temporal span, thereby allowing the human body to adapt progressively instead of suffering an abrupt physiological shutdown. Following the theoretical groundwork, the training transitioned to intensive instrument work. This novel technique demanded an absolute, unwavering trust in altimeters, particularly in perilous situations where every ingrained instinct screamed at the pilot to initiate an immediate recovery. Instructors meticulously guided pilots through repetitive practice sessions in link trainers, rudimentary yet effective flight simulators of the era. Here, they meticulously rehearsed dive profiles repeatedly, continuously vocalizing their altitudes. Passing 3,000, holding angle. Passing 2,500, holding angle. Passing 2,000, sight picture, steady. 1,800, initiating pullout. These deliberate verbal callouts served to keep their conscious minds actively engaged, effectively counteracting the debilitating tunnel vision that frequently led to a critical loss of altitude awareness under stress. Pilots persevered in these exercises until the callouts became entirely automatic, an ingrained verbal rhythm that would persist even amidst the intense pressures of combat. The actual flight training systematically introduced the new technique in carefully calibrated, graduated steps. The inaugural flights involved practice dives conducted without any live bomb load, with pullouts commencing at 2,200 feet, a mere 300 feet lower than the former established doctrine. Instructors flew alongside in chase aircraft, providing continuous, real-time altitude updates via radio. Pilots diligently learned to discern the precise visual cues corresponding to the critical 1,800-foot mark, the apparent size of the target, the specific geometry of the horizon, and the exact sight picture that unequivocally signaled the moment for recovery. They diligently practiced the gradual pullout, mastering the art of applying steady, measured back pressure rather than the abrupt, forceful yanking of the stick. Concurrently, they practiced sophisticated anti-G straining maneuvers, which were initiated pre-pullout and maintained throughout the entire recovery phase. This involved learning to grunt forcefully with each exhalation, simultaneously tensing their leg and abdominal muscles in a coordinated effort to trap vital blood flow within the upper body, particularly the brain and eyes. By August of 1943, the Naval Air Station Jacksonville was consistently graduating pilots who could reliably execute bomb releases from altitudes ranging between 1,700 and 900 feet, achieving circular error probables of under 40 feet, and crucially, reporting zero-G-induced incidents. While this enhanced training regimen extended the curriculum by an additional 3 weeks compared to the previous program, the superior results were utterly irrefutable. Squadrons that subsequently received these newly trained pilots reported remarkable accuracy improvements, ranging between 35% and 50%, when contrasted with squadrons still employing traditional, higher-altitude release techniques. Even more significantly, the training accident rate plummeted to virtually zero. Although pilots undoubtedly continued to experience apprehension, the act of diving to 1,800 feet before recovery demanded every ounce of their discipline. They were no longer succumbing to fatal training accidents. The efficacy of the technique was unequivocally proven, necessitating its rapid deployment across every carrier air group operating in both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, in anticipation of the next wave of major military operations. The delayed pull-out technique received its baptism of fire and first large-scale combat validation during Operation Forager, the pivotal invasion of the Marianas in June 1944. Task Force 58, comprising an formidable armada of 15 fleet carriers, converged upon the Philippine Sea, and every dive bomber squadron assigned to this force had undergone intensive retraining in the new doctrine over the preceding 8 months. On June 19th, amidst the ferocious aerial engagements that would forever be etched into history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American dive bombers faced their ultimate test and achieved profound validation. Japanese carriers launched a series of massive, coordinated strikes that completely overwhelmed American combat air patrol controllers. Consequently, an urgent directive was issued, ordering dive bombers to pivot from their primary mission of attacking enemy ships to intercepting the incoming Japanese strike packages before they could inflict damage upon the American fleet. What ensued was an unprecedented and extraordinary test of bombing accuracy under the most intense combat conditions imaginable. Lieutenant Commander James Ramage, commanding Bombing Squadron 10, VB-10, from the aircraft carrier Enterprise, led his squadron against a formidable formation of Japanese carrier bombers at an altitude of 12,000 feet, an elevation where dive bombing had historically been regarded as marginal at best. Employing the newly perfected delayed pull-out technique, his pilots initiated their dives from this considerable altitude, bravely holding their descent directly through the heart of the Japanese formation, and releasing their ordnance at altitudes consistently below 2,000 feet, all while maintaining speeds exceeding 280 knots. The ensuing bombing accuracy was utterly devastating. Post-action analysis unequivocally credited VB-10 with destroying or severely damaging an astonishing 23 Japanese aircraft in a single, audacious pass, accuracy rates that would have been deemed utterly impossible with the antiquated high-release technique. Ramage's own bomb struck a K-torpedo bomber with such pinpoint precision that the subsequent explosion scattered wreckage across a quarter-mile radius. Crucially, not a single pilot within his squadron reported even a partial blackout during their recovery maneuvers. The comprehensive statistical data extracted from the Marianas operation painted an undeniable picture of success. Dive bomber squadrons that had adopted the delayed pull-out technique achieved remarkable hit rates of 32% against highly maneuvering warships, a stark improvement compared to the historical averages of 18% to 22% observed in earlier naval engagements. During the critical strikes against Japanese carriers on June 20th, bombs released below 2,000 feet accounted for an impressive 14 of the 18 direct hits officially recorded by American dive bombers. The formidable Japanese carrier Hyo, for instance, sustained 3 direct hits in rapid succession from VB-2 pilots, all of whom released their bombs between 1,500 and 1,850 feet. These bombs penetrated the flight deck with such incredible precision that 2 of them actually entered the very same elevator shaft. The carrier succumbed to the damage and sank within hours. Subsequent post-war analysis of the wreckage confirmed impact patterns clustered within an astonishing 50-foot circle, a level of accuracy that would have been considered utterly unattainable merely 18 months prior. Pilot survival statistics demonstrated an equally profound and dramatic improvement. Over the 6-month period immediately following the widespread implementation of the delayed pull-out training, incidents of G-induced loss of consciousness plummeted by an astounding 91% across all carrier air groups. Furthermore, combat loss rates directly attributable to dive accidents declined to statistically insignificant levels, fewer than 1 pilot per 1,000 sorties, a stark and life-saving contrast to the harrowing 15 per 1,000 recorded during the grim early days of 1943. The innovative technique had not only completely resolved the critical blackout crisis, but had also achieved something of even greater strategic importance. It had fundamentally redefined the very capabilities and potential of dive bombing as a tactical weapon. The newfound ability to release ordnance with exquisite accuracy from ultra-low altitudes meant that dive bombers could now effectively engage targets that had previously necessitated the deployment of multiple squadrons. A single aircraft could now achieve mission-critical kills on destroyers, while a 2-plane section possessed the capability to effectively disable cruisers. By the time the arduous Okinawa campaign commenced in April 1945, the delayed pull-out technique had become so thoroughly ingrained and integrated into standard dive bomber doctrine that newly arrived young pilots from training command were entirely unaware that any other technique had ever existed. They had been rigorously trained to ride their dives down to the critical 1,800-foot mark from their very first training hop, and by comparison, the old, high-altitude releases seemed recklessly inaccurate and dangerously inefficient. The final, conclusive statistics compiled from the Pacific War unequivocally demonstrated that dive bombers, whose crews had been trained in the delayed pull-out technique, sank or damaged an astonishing 47% more enemy shipping per sortie than squadrons still employing the pre-1943 methods. This remarkable efficiency was achieved with significantly lower loss rates, substantially improved pilot survival, and an unparalleled level of accuracy that utterly transformed the dive bomber from a broad-area weapon into a precision instrument of unparalleled effectiveness. The technique that had initially been perceived as suicidally dangerous in 1943 had, by the war's end, become the gold standard by which all other bombing methods were meticulously measured. The pioneering pilots, who had learned to place their trust in the immutable laws of physics over their innate instincts, who had rigorously trained themselves to sustain those screaming, adrenaline-fueled dives for just a few seconds longer than every nerve in their bodies demanded, had, in essence, rewritten the fundamental rules of naval aviation. And they had accomplished this profound transformation by mastering the art of pulling out late.